Hi, everybody. How you doing today? It's wonderful to be back on campus. I'm excited to talk to you about art, life, and risk. When I was a young art student, my teachers always talked to me about taking risks with my artwork. And likewise, when I was a professor here, I taught here for 32 years, taught painting and drawing. When I was a professor here, I talked constantly to my students about risk, trying to encourage them to take risk with their artwork. In many ways, it was the only thing I ever even recall teaching them and encouraging them to do. The problem is they always had trouble taking risk. And to be honest, I don't even know what risk is half the time. So to start my research for this talk, I decided to look up the definition of risk. And as you can see, risk involves the possibility of loss, the potential of failure or some kind of pain, and the possibility of something going bad. Now, this is really kind of interesting to me because it's all about the possibility of these things happening. So in a sense, risk lives in our imagination. It's not something that happens necessarily, it's something that we imagine happens. So when it comes to making artwork, as an artist myself, my struggles in my studio are pretty much all about my inability to take risks with my art. I'm always challenging myself with that. Likewise with my students, it was always very difficult for them to take risks, and I was always challenging them. So, what is risk? The odd thing is, when it comes to making art and taking risks, it shouldn't be that difficult. I could never figure that out. I would always tell my students it's not brain surgery. There's a picture of a brain. Nobody's going to die. You're not an engineer. You're not creating a bridge, and it's going to collapse. So what is the deal with art making and taking risk? Why is it so difficult? In fact, students I would tell them they're in a discipline where they can't really make a mistake. They can't get it wrong. There's no straight answer. They're creating something. Yet the fear of risk was always there for so many students. I eventually concluded that risk in art making is related to how we identify with the thing that we're making. We wrap up all of our experiences and desires in this thing we make as individuals. And I kind of think we're hardwired for this. Think of the phrase we use all the time for making art, self-expression, the expression of the self. What does this imply? It implies that we're making something that has to do with our own experiences, that we're making something that has to do with the things we feel and the things we think about and the things we value. But the problem with this is we want to try to communicate these things to the viewer. An individual's unique identity and human perspective is all wrapped up in the work that they make. And to make art, the dilemma is that we have to risk losing our own sense of identity in the art we make. So I'd like you all to imagine creating a painting for a moment. Imagine you have a blank canvas in front of you. You make a mark, you make another mark, you add some color, you add a form. Maybe it's a pear, or maybe it's an apple, or maybe it's a bowl. And it's going along just great, when suddenly it isn't. Suddenly it's a big mess, and you don't know what to do with it. Suddenly the work of art starts to inform its own creation. Okay, it sounds kind of weird, but it starts to have a conversation with you. This is very, very frustrating. It's kind of starting to fight you. Artists call this the process. And it's important for artists to pay attention to the process of making their art, to kind of give in to it. And this is where the sense of self that we kind of wrap up with our art and our ego are separate. David Bales has a great quote about this, and it's up on the screen right now. There's an irony in this for those of us involved in creative work. That irony is that to grow and evolve as a creative artist, we must always risk failure. We must risk failure in both the art we make and the lives we live. While I understand the concern a person might have as they court disaster in their lives, it still perplexes me that artists have a hard time doing this in their art. When an artist makes a work of self-expression, in my opinion, they are not expressing themselves. They're creating a work of other expression. So another way to think about this is that it's not about me, the artist, it's about you, the viewer. So when you go look at a work of art, you try to connect with it, or you hope the work connects with your life in some way. It's about you. It's about your hopes, how you view the world. And this is a real interesting dilemma for an artist, how to make their artwork connect with another person in that way, in that very deep and important way. So being an experiential sort of guy, I need a little drink. Being an experiential kind of guy, I decided to create a project where I would make a painting that would challenge me, there'd be the risk of losing control would be built into the process. And I came up with the idea called the folding, unfolding painting. The idea came from, I was inspired by the surrealist artists had this parlor game they created called The Exquisite Corpse. And I know that sounds kind of gross, and if you don't know what it was a game they invented where they would take a piece of paper and fold it into thirds, and an artist would draw on one of the thirds and then fold it back to a blank spot and then draw on it. Another artist would draw on it, and so on until the whole sheet of paper was full of the drawing. And then they would unfold it and be this like wonderful little surprise. Remember, this is before YouTube and stuff. So they would look at what they had created, and then there was a whole bunch it was a very random kind of process. And of course, the surrealists, being into randomness and everything, were really involved in this whole idea. I decided to take this concept and scale it up, challenging myself by creating a painting, like I said, called the Unfolding and Folding Canvas. And you can see the start of it right here on the screen. That's just a hunk of canvas I had laying around the studio. And I folded it up into about 2-foot sections. And here's me folding and unfolding. And then as I exposed a piece of blank canvas, I would paint on it. Here I am doing a painting. And it was a really interesting process in that I would create a painting. I was creating a painting. The challenge in all this was that I was creating a painting that I couldn't see the whole thing. I could only see these little chunks and little sections as they evolved. I could kind of get a sense of what the painting was going to be because I would see different aspects of it as I would unfold it and refold it. But I never had a sense of the whole composition. How all the different parts related. And this was an extreme challenge for me because one of the most important things about an artist's work is, especially a painter, is this idea of the continuity of the work, the way the forms relate to one another, and how the whole thing works as a unit. So I could only get glimpses of these little bits and pieces of the painting. So I would kind of look at one section and then try to imagine how the new one I'm making relates to that section and so on and so forth. So most of the painting existed in my imagination. I could not see the whole thing. And this was a really interesting and very challenging process. By doing this, I removed much of my control of what the final painting would look like. Of course, I do still control aspects of the work within the context of that small section. I work on how I imagine it relates to the other sections. And there is a struggle here between what I imagine I'm making and what the painting will eventually look like. Again, it was an extremely challenging and uncomfortable way to make a painting. An artist strives to create pictorial unity. The goal is to create a unified composition with parts relating to one another. But the risk I took was to discard that. In setting up the rules for making this painting, I did stick to certain patterns and colors and forms. I didn't paint a picture of Mickey Mouse in one section and an apple in another, anything crazy like that. So I tried to think of it as unified composition, but again, I continued to challenge that and question that in the work. I would suggest that this is a lot like how life is. We try to orchestrate the outcome, but in the end, it is all an unknown and unforeseen adventure. So now I'm going to show you my painting I made here. There it is. Oh, that's such a huge mess. Now, keep in mind that I didn't know how big this was even when I was working on it, so I didn't even know how big it was until about 2 weeks ago. So I brought this in for the talk, and we couldn't put it on the stage because I was just like, what did I get myself into? So it's a big, big mess. And to me, it's a lot about how life is. I mean, I think we try to predict the outcome of our lives. We try to control our lives. But like this painting, I could only see a bit of my past. I could only kind of imagine my past as I worked on it, and my future was blank. All I could work on was that moment, that little 2-foot section that I could pay attention to. And I think the risk we need to take in our lives, like I did with this painting, is to stay in the moment, to try to sort of embrace the moment and the wonderment that we can find there, and make our lives a big mess. Thank you.